I am so thankful I married a teacher because there were 4 myths that being married to a teacher, 4 myths that I held that were broken, and I understood things, I understood life a little bit better. Myth number 1 was that teachers live at the school. As a little kid, I was always amazed when we would go grocery shopping and we would see my teacher in the grocery store. Back then, Barrie wasn't a real big town, and there were only 2 or 3 grocery stores, and it was very common that you would run into people. And I remember running into Miss Marshall at the grocery store, and I was astounded, like, what is she doing here? She belongs at school. It blew me away. Well, I've learned that teachers do not live at school. I also have learned that teachers have first names. Because all the years I was in school, elementary school especially, and high school, I guess, it was always Mr. this, Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Slesser, Mrs. White. They actually have first names. I was astounded. I go to Sharon's school, and you would wonder, because when they talk to each other, it's still Mrs. this and Mrs. that and Mr. Wagner. But then when the kids aren't around, they actually say words like Sharon and Paul. It's astounding. Teachers have first names. Who'd have known? Another myth that was broken, I never knew this until I married a teacher. Teachers do not want you to fail. They, especially depending on who you are, will push you into the next class. They really are not out to make life miserable, to make you fail. I had never understood that. And then the final myth that I never fully understood is that tests are not intended to deceive, beguile, and facilitate that failure. There's actually a purpose to tests that includes learning. Who knew? Well, in Genesis 22, the story opens with a line that introduces a little bit of crises, and if we don't understand the story properly, a myth. But hopefully by the end of our time looking at this, we'll have that myth debunked. The story opens in Genesis 22 that God decided to test Abraham. We're going to look at that story this morning, and what I want to do is just tell you the story. But before we get there, we need to look at a little bit of backstory and fill in the gaps, because Genesis 22 did not happen in a vacuum. As Moses wrote Genesis 22, he was recording what God had told him. This is part of the law. What God had told him as he was going up and down Mount Sinai, and they're in the wilderness. This is after the Exodus. They're learning about the nature of their God. For 400 years, they've been slaves in Egypt. They've been saturated. Their minds have adapted, their culture has adapted and been influenced by the polytheistic gods of Egypt. Now they're learning who the one true God is, the nature of the relationship between this God, creator of heaven and earth, and these people. I will be your God, you will be my people. And Genesis 22 is written in that context. The audience is sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they are learning from Moses who this God is. There are 2 sections to the story of Genesis 22. The first section tells the narrative of Abraham and his camping trip with his son Isaac. The second part focuses on the covenant relationship that God is going to have with his people. And we'll pull all that together in just a minute. But first, let's do a little backstory. In Exodus chapter 3, God speaks to Moses. This is before the Exodus. And there are just a couple of details we need to understand. Remember, these people have just left Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They're sitting in the wilderness at the foot of Mount Sinai, about to go into the promised land, and they are still in the process of learning, who is our God? Is he trustworthy? And if he is, how do I trust him? So in Exodus chapter 3, verse 15, it says, God furthermore said to Moses, you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. Now, we're not into any Jacob stories yet, but certainly Abraham and Isaac. So you're at the foot of Mount Sinai, and you're going to hear this story about Abraham and Isaac. He has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey, and they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and shall say to him, now remember, this has just happened. They have just escaped Egypt. So as Moses writes this part of the story of Exodus, he is also telling them the story of Genesis 22. All right? This is what's happening. This is where they are. And here's what they're to do. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Now here's a little spoiler alert. 3 days figures into the story of Abraham in Genesis 22. There's a connection. There's a mindset here that if you're going to worship God, it's hard to know if this was something that just existed in the culture of Mesopotamia at the time or exactly where this came from, but they had a cultural understanding that to worship God took at least 3 days of preparation. We'll unpack that some other day. That's Old Testament theology that's beyond our scope this morning. But they're going to travel 3 days, so they're to say to Pharaoh, let us travel 3 days so we can go and sacrifice to the Lord our God. What is Abraham going to do? He's told by God to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. So as he tells the story of Genesis 22, this is what is happening in real time in the lives of his audience, the Hebrews at the foot of Mount Sinai. Fast forward to chapter 19 of Exodus, and the Lord said to Moses, now this is when they're already in the wilderness at the foot of Mount Sinai. Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak to you, and you may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the people of the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. So on the third day, God's going to, after they've done this preparation, God is going to appear on Mount Sinai. Again, a cultural thing. We don't fully understand the significance of 3 days, but in their culture and their mindset, it took 3 days to prepare to worship God. And what happens in Genesis 22? They're going to travel for 3 days, as you're going to see in just a bit. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of the people. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day, and do not go near a woman. And on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud of the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. And all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God after 3 days of preparation. Okay, so that's the backstory. And after all that happens, sometime shortly afterwards, or perhaps during this process, Moses is telling the story of Genesis chapter 22. That's part of the law, an orientation to who is our God? Is he trustworthy? And if so, how do I trust him? Now, before I tell the story, and I'm going to tell it rather than just read it, here are a couple of notable things to keep in mind as we go through this. First, this is described in Genesis 22, verse 1, as a test. Sometime later, sometime after Isaac was born, God decided he was going to test Abraham, and he says to Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. But the idea of a test, this God, at the end of the story, it says that God says, now I now know the nature of your heart. It's not that God didn't know that before. This is not a test to learn something. This idea of test is to demonstrate the quality of something. As I wrote in the email that went out on Friday and today, how do you know an authentic diamond from a piece of glass, an authentic $100 bill from a counterfeit, whether water is actually safe to drink or it's filled with pathogens? You run a test to determine its quality. That's the concept behind the word test here. Now, we have the inside track. Abraham did not know this was going to be a test. We're given the behind-the-scenes glimpse. So we have to remember that in all of this, this is a test of quality to see the nature of Abraham's faith. And it's been important for them, the children of Israel, at the foot of Mount Sinai, as they go out to meet their God. And it's important for us as we wrestle with the question, is God trustworthy? And if so, how do I trust him? What do we learn about the nature of faith because of what Abraham experienced in chapter 22? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is, as Moses tells this story, much like he did in the story we looked at last week, he uses these mirror images or these mirror phrases and brings the peak of the story into the middle. So he repeats phrases like, take your son, your only son. That's in verse 2 and verse 16. He uses the phrase, the two of them walk on together in verse 6 and in verse 8. He references the servants in verse 5 and verse 19. There's a lifting up of the eyes in verse 4 and verse 13. It's called, the technical term for this is a chiasm, that there are corresponding parts in the story that focus on a center. So as I tell the story, I've written my notes in a way that hopefully I'll emphasize those things. And third, there are some components to their history, their reality, that are stressed in this story, but also have a theological significance. The fact is not just Isaac, but his only son Isaac. And we know how Abraham longed to have a son and was promised a son. And his first failure to try and accomplish that promise on his own terms. And yet God is still gracious to him and gives him a son on God's terms. For the ancient peoples, as they move into this promised land, they need to know at the foot of Mount Sinai in the wilderness, about to go into the promised land, that this is the land promised them to their forefather, Abraham, who lived hundreds of years before. And this was part of God fulfilling his promise. There's this idea of meeting God, that Abraham has this conversation with God, and God engages with him, just like they're going out, according to Exodus 19, preparing themselves for 3 days, and God is going to come down on the mountain, and Moses says, come and meet your God. It's important because their idea of the gods, as I've said before, this polytheistic system of Egypt was all about the gods being distant, unknowable, non-relational. And yet the God of Israel is a God who knows his people. And then there's the covenant and obedience that we'll see at the end of the story. So for now, let me just try and tell the story. It's a fun story. I love this story. And I'm not going to read the verses until we get to the end and highlight a couple of things. I just want to tell you the story. So one day, Abraham is out doing something. We don't know what. As I said last week, changing the oil in his camel or something like that. And God appears to him and he says, Abraham. And Abraham immediately responds. How he knows it's God, we don't know. But he says, here I am. And God says, I want you to do something. I want you to take your son, your only son, and go and offer him as a sacrifice to me. Now let's think about that for a moment. How bizarre is that you've struggled for years to have this child and suddenly God is saying, now I want you to give him back to me? I don't think that in the culture, in the Egyptian religion, that would have been so unusual. Child sacrifice was a part of their polytheistic approach to faith and religion. But it seems a little odd that the God of all creation would say this, but this builds the tension. How could the God of Israel say to Abraham, the founder of the nation, I want you to sacrifice your child? There's a crisis. It's a test. Abraham doesn't know that, but a crisis is introduced. But Abraham obeys. And in telling the story, Moses loves to draw out the tension by sharing details. It says Abraham went and he saddled his donkey, and he took some young men, and he cut down some wood, and he went to the place that God had told him. So that took some time to get all the logistics together. If you've ever gone camping, you know it takes a while to get the tent in the car and to get all your Coleman stove loaded up and the food in the cooler, and there are just a myriad of things. I can't imagine what it must have been like for Abraham. But he gets all his camping equipment together and they head out, and he's going to a place that's unknown to him, just like the children of Israel. And it's a place that God has told him to go, just like the children of Israel. The points of contact here are amazing. So they travel, they camp for 3 days. They're out enjoying the mosquitoes and the black flies and whatever else was there. And I don't know how the camping logistic worked back in the day, but on the 3rd day, he lifts up his eyes. And Moses emphasizes that detail in the story. And he sees the place. And he says to the young men that are accompanying him, "You stay here while my son and I go and worship God." So, in the same way, Moses repeats detail. He takes the wood. He lays it on Isaac. He takes a knife and he takes fire. And then the two of them continue on together. An interesting little phrase, the two of them walk on together. It's repeated in the story later on to help bring this tension to a peak. And while they're walking, there's a question posed by Isaac. So obviously he's old enough to be able to carry this load of wood, old enough to process what's going on. He's not just a little toddler. He's maybe a teenager. We really don't know. And he asks his dad, he says, "Dad, we've got the wood and the fire, but where's everything else? Where's the lamb? What are we going to do?" Well, the answer that Abraham gives, and I think we've all done this as parents. Your kids ask you a difficult question, you don't really know the answer, you come up with a dodge that will solve the problem and get them to stop answering questions. So Abraham's answer was, God will provide. And the extent to which he believed that, we don't fully know. This is the test. What does that mean? And then Moses uses that phrase again, the two of them walk on together. Think about that. Here they are. For years, Abraham has wanted a son. Finally gets the son. And now God says, sacrifice the son. And for 3 days, he's got to think about what's at the end of this journey. And the two of them walk on together. And finally, they come to the place. And Abraham builds an altar. And he lays down the wood. And he lays down Isaac on top of the wood. And he ties his son up. And the way Moses tells the story, he just stretches out these details, heightening the crises and the tension. And then he says, and Abraham placed his hand on the knife, and he took the knife and was ready to kill his son. Now, who needs that kind of detail? Well, a good storyteller who's dragging it out so we feel the tension along with Abraham to the point that you can almost see the fingers going around the hilt of that knife, and what was going through his mind as he's thinking, I have to do this. God told me to do this. And he's about to kill his son when the angel of the Lord calls to him. And the identity of that, whether that was Christ in pre-incarnate form or literally an angel, we don't know, whoever it was, calls out to him again. And Abraham again responds with the phrase, "Here I am." And at this moment of ultimate tension, was his hand still in the air? Was he going to kill his son? The first time the children of Israel heard this story, they're probably waiting for Moses to, come on, what's going to happen? The tension fills the story. We have a communication between God and his servant Abraham. Exodus 19, come and prepare to meet your God. This is our God. He will be present. He is aware of what's happening. He knows that moment that Abraham is going to kill his son. He's very aware of the circumstances. He didn't go away. He didn't fall asleep. He didn't lose interest. And at that exact instant that the tension was the highest, the angel of the Lord speaks to him and says, do not lay your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And that was the question. Abraham, do you fear God? Abraham then lifts up his eyes. Moses uses that phrase again. And he looks and he sees a ram caught in a thicket. And he goes and together with his son, they take that ram and offer it as a burnt sacrifice. In the end of the story, there's this little commentary. And Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Where's Israel? Where are the Hebrews? They're at the foot of Mount Sinai. They're living in a wilderness, about to go into the promised land. They needed to know that God would provide for them, would provide for their immediate needs. And as they wandered around the wilderness, that hasn't happened yet. But as they will be wandering around the wilderness, they complained about the food, they complained about the water, they complained about their clothes, they complained about shelter. They nominated a committee to get them back to Egypt. They were very discontent. And Moses tells them this story. At the mount of God, he will provide. That's where they were. He's trying to help them understand, who is this God? This is the God who provides for his people. So then we have the end of the story. In chapter 22, verse 15. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. So this is actually the third communication with God. The first time was at the beginning, and God says, Abraham, and Abraham says, where am I? The second time is intervening, so Abraham doesn't kill his son. And now there's this theological commentary where the angel of the Lord speaks a second time from heaven. And he said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. And you'll notice in your Bibles, it's L-O-R-D, all in caps, Yahweh, the covenantal name for God. Abraham probably didn't know Yahweh by the name Yahweh. That was something revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Yet Moses puts that into this ancient story that happened a couple of hundred years before. He redacts it. So he has Abraham worshiping the same God that the Israelites, the Hebrews at the foot of Mount Sinai are worshiping. By myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, the covenant faithful God, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, surely I will bless you, and surely I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your offspring the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and they lived at Beersheba. So there's this blessing then because of Abraham's faithfulness. So what's the point? What's Moses trying to teach the children of Israel, the Hebrews? What's the theology behind this? Well, the whole story focuses on, the crisis is resolved, focuses on the Lord will provide. That was the nature of Abraham's faith. And from what we read in Hebrews, the commentary made in Hebrews is that Abraham assumed that God was even able to raise his son from the dead. Somehow, even though this was his son, his only son, and he was asked in a bizarre way to sacrifice him, which seems totally contrary to the ethics of the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments, for example, he believed that God was able to raise him from the dead. But because he had that faith in God, his actions aligned with what he believed. On the mountain of the Lord will provide. And that's where the Israelites were. And they needed to learn. Moses wanted to teach them that although you're intimidated right now by this thunder and the lightning and the smoke on the mountain, and you're here to meet your God, and you're going to step back and fall down afraid, the day is going to come when you are going to forget the nature of your God. And you need to remember not just this moment, but remember our forefather Abraham and the crises that he faced that made no sense at all. Killing your son, your only son, that is bizarre. That makes no sense at all. And yet God will provide. And that becomes a repeated theme throughout the story in Exodus. And as Israel moves into their wanderings and then finally into the promised land, all sourced in this story of Abraham. But for the Israelites, when they think about God providing, it wasn't just saving a son, but God providing in their very real needs for food, water, shelter, protection from the enemy, and their willingness to do what God asked them to do by going into the promised land, even though the spies came back and said, this thing is not a doable thing. So in Hebrews 11:17, as we read earlier, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. And that is what God was looking for. These are not just lessons in a historical story, but there's a theology here that's being taught to the Israelites as they learn about the nature of the one true God, the Creator God, and the way He engages with His people. That God is present in time of crises. The mindset that came out of their previous religious experience, the theology of the gods of Egypt, for example, is that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. If you're having a crisis, the gods must be judging you. Maybe you can figure out through trial and error what it is that has annoyed the gods and resolve the thing. But the God of Israel is not like that. The God, the profile that Moses is presenting to the children of Israel in the story of Abraham is a God who, yes, is willing to test his people, but he is also present with them in the crises. And he is aware, and in that critical moment, he never abandoned. He was aware and he interrupted because there was a bigger thing that had to happen. That this God is knowable, that this God expresses himself, that he engages with his people. And as they sit at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses says, "Come and meet your God," he's also teaching them that this God is a God who will care for them and will make his will and his way known. And that was the whole point of the law. The law was not to establish a new religion. It was not to establish new rules and rituals to displace the old ones. It was to help Israel know how to be reconciled to God through expressing their faith in God and worshiping him in the instrument of the sacrificial system, ultimately fulfilled in Christ. The promise that God is making to Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai is demonstrated in the real life activity of Abraham, that God interrupted at just the right time to accomplish his purpose. Now, that is not to say that every time we face a crisis, if we have enough faith, God's going to interrupt and fix the problem. This is not about finding solutions. I wish it was. I wish I could figure that out. I would write my book, and Sharon and I would retire in some chalet somewhere. But it's not like that. This is not a promise that if you do all the right steps, you're going to get all the right outcomes. Rather, this is a commentary that the God of creation is observant to what is happening in his creation. And he expects those who say, "You are my God," to be obedient to him. And in the Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about even those who did not see the end result of their faith. Even those people continued to have faith because they anticipated there was something greater yet to come. And that's the nature of faith. Hebrews starts out with, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. There's a deferred gratification that is inherent in living by faith. But we need to have an object to our faith, and that object is Almighty God. And as we understand more of his nature and his character and see the track record of his faithfulness to his people, to Abraham, who wanted a son, couldn't have a son, tried to have a son, that didn't work out, but then God did a miraculous thing and they had their own son, to saving him from this sacrifice, to the stories of Isaac and then Jacob and the entire history of Israel as they finally ultimately move into the promised land and they fall and they get up and they fall and they get up, and David and all the mistakes that he makes, Solomon, then the kingdom falls apart. On and on it goes. Till ultimately Christ come, we still see there is faithfulness of God. And this is the God we worship. that he is faithful to us as he is the object of our faith, as we express and embrace the exclusive relationship that is faith in God. As the children of Israel sat around the bottom of Mount Sinai, and Moses invites them to come and meet your God, I think what he's saying to them is if we have a grand view of God, a large view, one that admittedly we cannot truly articulate or put into a box because God is eternal and infinite, our minds just can't comprehend everything, yet he's revealed himself to us. Although we may not understand everything, we do know that what does happen is accomplishing a greater purpose. Solomon put it this way, Ecclesiastes 5, one of my favorite verses. God is in heaven, you are on earth, let your words be few. We need to be careful to presume to speak for God. This is happening because, or if only this, then this. No, God is the God who is orchestrating every detail in his creation. What he does expect from his people is obedience, faithfulness, honoring and worshiping him exclusively. But in the story of Abraham, the story of David, the story of Solomon, the story of the Apostle Peter, we see amazing demonstrations of messing up. And yet the grace of God, the faithfulness of God to respond to his people. And that's the whole point of the story in Genesis 22, that God will provide because God is God, not because of the condition of Abraham's faith. This test was intended to reveal, to demonstrate the nature of his faith, but it was not the condition of blessing. God blessed Abraham because he loved him and had promised this covenant relationship with him. There is nothing we can do to make God love us more or to make God love us less. There's nothing we can do to push his buttons, to manipulate him, to get him to do what we want so we fix our problems. But from time to time, God is going to say to us, let me see the nature of your faith. Are you willing to demonstrate that I am your God exclusively? So is God trustworthy? Yes. But confessing in a trustworthy God also means that we declare and practice loyalty and exclusivity and our dependence upon him as we submit to him as our God. The story of Chapter 22 ends with a long list of names of people affiliated with Abraham, his son or his brother and others who then also are very prolific in having kids and establishing their families. And it goes on about how all these people come because Abraham was faithful to God. So this is not a formula. If you want something from God, here's the input. This is a demonstration. This is a testing of authenticity. This is what real faith looks like. Real faith looks like unmitigated trust in God, even though we may be in crises or chaos. It means recognizing that he is God and I am not. And it means I make a commitment to obey him, even if that obedience is uncomfortable and causes crises. That's the nature of Abraham's faith. And those are the life faith skills we nurture together as we walk in faith and seek to represent Christ well in the life that he's given us.